while we're waiting for people to hop in. So thank you all for coming out to this Tech Coach today, which is our State of Middle Tennessee Tech 2020 report, and it's being presented by Dr. Amy Harris. So today's session is going to be a review of the latest Tech Workforce Report that provides an updated summary of the Middle Tennessee Tech workforce as a whole, as well as the major occupation groups identified within the tech workforce. It's also going to include an overview of the current tech job supply, job demand, and demographic diversity. Today's presenter is, of course, Dr. Amy Harris, who is an associate professor and graduate program director at MTSU. And we will be taking questions, so I just encourage everyone to submit any questions you have through our Q&A button at the bottom, and at the end, Amy will get to as many questions as possible. So with that said, I'm going to pass it over to you, Amy.
Hi, as my slides go out of control, hello everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this Tech Coach session. I'm very excited to be here and talk to you a little bit about our findings from the latest publication in our research program, the State of Middle Tennessee Tech 2020 report. This is, anybody who knows me knows that this is a passion project of mine. And before we get into the numbers, I thought I would share a little bit of the history of this project. So the Middle Tennessee Tech Research Program was established in 2018. It is a joint partnership between my department at MTSU, the Department of Information Systems and Analytics, and the NTC. And the project started really because as we were talking about it, you know, there are lots of reports on the tech workforce. There are reports that are published from national entities, state entities, you know, there's all sorts of people producing this type of research, but we didn't have anything that we felt like that was not only homegrown, because there were some homegrown reports, but homegrown and specific to Middle Tennessee. And even more specifically to that reported data that we felt was truly reflective of the diversity of work in tech in Middle Tennessee. So we founded this joint program in 2018. That was the first year that we published one of these reports. What we're going to be talking about today is the third installment in this pipeline of research. We've also done some additional white papers that have taken deeper dives into subspecialties. I'll be showing you the website where, if you're interested in going and checking those out, we'll talk about that here at the end. But yes, I would encourage you. I built the presentation today to make sure that there was plenty of time for the Q&A. So do please take advantage of that feature, and we'll get to those questions. We'll get to those questions at the end. So I like to give a lot of background and a lot of context, because I don't think that numbers are particularly meaningful if people don't have a way of kind of processing and understanding what's being presented. So before we dive into numbers, I want to spend a little bit of time helping you understand what it is that, when you see the numbers, what those represent. So the first thing that we need to define is, well, what is our definition of tech? I mentioned just a minute ago that part of our impetus for starting this project is because we wanted to produce research that we felt was reflective of what we saw, the diversity of work and talent here in Middle Tennessee. So when we set out to define tech, we initially identified 26 occupations as defined by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. The BLS has an occupation classification system. We saw no need to reinvent the wheel, so we used their occupations and we combed through it looking for occupations that we deemed appropriate to include. And that ultimately led us to 26 occupations that include not just those traditional tech occupations that you normally see included in tech research, but also those occupations that are at the intersection of tech and business and mathematics. We wanted to make sure that we were capturing IT project managers and business analysts and data scientists. All of those occupations that we know are part of the tech ecosystem, but might not be adequately captured using traditional approaches. And so we landed on those 26, and we still use versions of those 26 occupations. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is in a process of transitioning from the codes we used originally to a new set of codes that will be fully implemented by 2021. And I'm very excited about where that's going to allow this research to go in the future, because those codes, they are more reflective of newer jobs. For instance, data scientist as an occupation is going to get its own code, and that's been that's an example of an occupation that it's been a bit difficult to get to in the past. So we've got those 26 occupations. For the sake of clarity in the report itself, we grouped those together. We rolled them up into 14 occupation groups. And when you see the data reported here in a minute in the presentation, most of it focuses on those 14 occupation groups, just to keep it manageable. So that's how we arrived at our definition of tech. The next thing is, how are we defining Middle Tennessee? For the purposes of this research, Middle Tennessee is defined as the Nashville Metropolitan Statistical Area, which is a 14-county area that has Nashville and Davidson County as its economic center. That's defined by the U.S. the U.S. Census Bureau. And then we also wanted to make sure that we were capturing Clarksville. So we added Montgomery County so that we have 15 counties that are included in the analysis. The last thing to understand as we start looking at the numbers is what types of workers are we included. And we included workers that fell into 3 buckets. The first bucket, and the bucket with the vast majority of jobs associated with it, is what's called a QCEW worker. And so these are workers who are captured via the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics quarterly census of employment and wages. So for the purposes of that program, a job is defined as a full or part-time position that is covered by state or federal unemployment insurance laws. And over 90% of the jobs that we're reporting here fall into that one bucket. There are also some workers who fall into what are the non-QCEW category, which is a class of worker. It's niche workers. So tech workers like work for churches or the railroad company. There are these very specific niches that non-QCEW workers would fall into. The last class of worker that we include are those tech workers who self-reported as tech workers. So those are captured via the Census Bureau conducts what's called the American Community Survey, and those workers are captured via that. So we aggregate data from these different government sources to be able to take a holistic perspective approach to analyzing the tech community. So with all of that background, now that we understand what's feeding into this, let's go ahead and let's take a look at some of the numbers. So we're going to start by looking at job growth, the trends from 2014 to 2024, the 10 years that were included in this analysis. So we're going to break this up into the past 5 years, 2014 to 2019. And I will say for the purpose of the jobs numbers reported here, the last year for which we have finalized data is 2019. And that's just due to there's a 3-quarter lag between when the Bureau of Labor Statistics, finishes collecting the data and when it's released to the public. So we have estimates for 2020 and moving beyond to 2024, but we won't have finalized numbers for 2020 until actually Q3 of this year. But as we look at the past growth for the years for which we have the hard numbers, from 2014 to 2019, the number of tech jobs in Middle Tennessee grew by 36%. I don't like to give numbers without providing some context here. So just to give you a sense of where that puts us, this rate of job growth outpaced national tech job growth by 13%, statewide tech job growth by 8%, and overall growth in Middle Tennessee by 20%. Moving forward, looking into the future, the projected growth rate for tech jobs in Middle Tennessee through 2024 is 16%. So that's, again, for some context, that's compared to projected 9% national tech job growth, 13% projected statewide job growth, and 10% projected growth across all occupations in Middle Tennessee. Taking a look at salary, median compensation for tech jobs in Middle Tennessee was just shy of 70K, 69.5 in 2019. That value is 16% below the national median for tech jobs, but that doesn't necessarily mean that workers in tech jobs here are underpaid. When you think about how the median is the 50th percentile, and when you look at salaries nationally, you have to consider that there are some markets, Silicon Valley, New York City, Boston, where there are a huge presence of tech jobs, but you also are in areas with very expensive costs of living, and so salaries have to be commensurate with the cost of living in those areas. I think it's going to be really fascinating to see how all of that changes and how the pandemic kind of reshapes that and the way people work and where people work. But that's where we are. So we were 16% below the national median for tech jobs, but when you look at compensation in Middle Tennessee, the median compensation for tech jobs in Middle Tennessee was 79% above the median compensation across all occupations in Middle Tennessee. The median compensation across all occupations is in the mid to upper 30s. So tech occupations command a much higher salary in the region than other types of work. All right, now let's start to peel back the layers a bit and take a look at jobs by our 14 occupation groups. So you can see here that the occupation group accounting for the largest number of jobs in Middle Tennessee was business and financial operations analyst, which that group grew 10.6% from 2018 to 2019 to just over 25,000 jobs. The occupation with the largest year-over-year growth in job volume was data scientist and mathematical science occupations, comma, all other, because there's always the BLS, there's an all other code in every single category of occupation that they collect data for. So that's the one with the biggest year-over-year growth. It's small in terms of job volume, but fast-paced growth there. And I think that even with data scientists, really, we're just beginning to be able to tease out data about that particular occupation. I think that's probably that number of jobs is a bit of an underestimate, because there might be people who are working in data science roles that perhaps their job is either evolved into that, or the people doing the reporting didn't exactly know where to put them. So we may have some buried in some of these other occupation groups as well. All right. Now let's take a look at salaries by occupation group. So, big shocker, the people who are commanding the highest salaries are your management occupations, with a median salary of about 118K. The occupation with the largest yearly percent increase in median salary was actually the lowest paid occupation in the lowest paid occupation group, which is our computer automated teller, and office machine repairers group. The median salary for this group increased 13.5% to just over $37,000 in 2019. And of the occupation groups listed, the median salary there is so low because this is really the most blue collar of the occupation groups that do belong to the tech scene. Most of the remaining jobs are kind of more of the professional white collar jobs. The other salary group that saw a big jump was, again, that data scientists and mathematical science occupations. They saw a double-digit jump in salary. It increased 11.5% up to $74,000 and some change. Just one second. All right, let's look at the diversity numbers, which was one of the more fascinating aspects of this research. So when we look at the age distribution, as I was just talking about, this is kind of more of a professional class of worker, and the age distribution that you see there is very typical of what you would see for a professional class of workers. You have very few people in those younger age buckets because some degree of education is required in order to enter the field, and then it follows the typical flow from there. As we move on to gender, there's some really interesting insights here. So to give some context, you can see on the slide, males occupy slightly over 60% of tech roles, females occupy slightly under. So it's basically 60-40 when you're looking at the top line. So to give some additional context on those top line numbers, women comprise 51% of the population in Middle Tennessee. They comprised 51% of the workforce in 2019, which are the numbers that we're looking at. I think it is going to be very fascinating moving forward to see what happens with that. We've all seen and heard the media reports that women have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and have had to leave the workforce at a higher rate. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how that impacts not only the percentage of the workforce as a whole that is female, but to see how it moves the needle when we zoom in to tech workers specifically. So based on population, based on percentage of the workforce, women still are underrepresented in tech occupations here in Middle Tennessee at that just shy of 40%. However, if you pay attention to gender representation research in tech, that number might actually seem like it is astoundingly positive. And so I want to take a moment and step back and say this is one of the things you have to be careful of when you're looking at data in the aggregate, because what it tells you in the aggregate can be very different from what it is when you start to zoom in a little bit closer. So there was a huge amount of variance in gender representation across the 26 occupations that we included in the study. So when we look at those individual occupations, 8 of the 26 of them, so just over 30% of them that were included, had female representation that was at or above that 39.6% that we see in the aggregate. All the rest of them were underneath, were below that number. And I guess another piece of context I forgot to give. So across tech occupations, female representation in Middle Tennessee was slightly higher than that observed for both the state and the nation. I mean, we really are about on par. Women occupied 39.6% of regional tech roles. That compares to 32.8% of national roles. So we are outpacing the nation in terms of female representation, and 39.3% of roles statewide. So we're just like decimal points ahead of the state in terms of female representation in tech occupations. So when we zoomed in and looked at gender representation for each of the 26 groups, the excuse me, female representation was the highest for marketing research analysts and marketing specialists, with females occupying over 61% of those roles. So very, very high representation there. The occupation with the lowest percent of female workers was, again, that computer, automated teller, and office machine repairers, where females were only 9.9% of jobs. So a lot of variance there. Now let's shift gears and talk a bit about race and ethnicity. So as we look at these numbers, non-white workers comprise 29% of the local population, 26% of the regional workforce, but only 22.5% of the regional tech workforce. The tech occupation with the most racial diversity, as measured by the percentage of non-white workers, which is admittedly a blunt instrument, but we do, in the details of the report, as you can see, we do break down the different race and ethnicity groups that fall into the non-white category. But at the high level, we're just using it as non-white workers. So the tech occupation with the most racial diversity was computer and information research scientists, where 33% of the roles were held by non-white workers. The occupation with the least racial diversity was marketing managers, where only 12.6% of the jobs were held by non-white workers. So when you think about how this compares to the state and Middle Tennessee. So when compared to the general working population of Middle Tennessee, the tech workforce has a higher percentage of white and Asian workers. That is also consistent with the nation. And when compared to the general working population, and here again in the region, the tech workforce has a lower percentage of Blacks and Hispanic or Latino workers. So work to do there to change that dynamic and see more diversity in our tech workforce. All right, now let's switch gears. Up to this point, everything that we've talked about has been reporting historic data, looking at jobs numbers that we get from state and federal data sources. Now we're going to switch gears a bit and spend the rest of our time looking at job demand. And that job demand is actually measured by online job postings that are being marketed to the Nashville market. And those are scraped off the web, aggregated and cleaned by our data vendor. So looking at different data here. And as you can see, the furthest point that we have back in time is September of 2016. So we can look at these trends and you can watch the line. I will say, per our vendor, this peak that you see mid 2019 is actually an aberration in the data. It was due to one aggregator putting on a sale, and it caused a huge spike in the number of postings for that period of time. So we'll just kind of set that aside in the discussion. And you can see that over the course of time, we have seen a steady increase in the number of jobs being marketed to the Nashville market. as you look at from from December of 2020, where we were just over 12,000 live postings, that is almost 2.5 times higher than the number of postings that were hovering around 5,000 back in September of 2016. But probably what's even more interest to everyone is what happened during 2020, because we do have the full year. So this peak right there is January of 2020. And then you can certainly see the effect of the pandemic as the number of postings dropped throughout the summer. But the good news is we saw a strong rebound in the second half of the year. For 2020, the number of postings in December of 2020 to end just slightly above where we were in January of 2020. So, I think that there's lots of room for optimism in this, especially when you think about the way that some industries in Middle Tennessee have been decimated by the pandemic, the service industry, the hospitality industry. It's not as though it didn't have any impact on us, in 2020, but as it goes, I think tech has weathered the storm relatively well. All right, so now let's take a look at demand by occupation group. So I'm sure, generally speaking, just to give some context, job demand for tech occupations in Middle Tennessee is slightly less than what would be expected for a region this size. For 2019, the average number of new monthly job postings across all tech occupations in the region was just over 3,600, which is 3% lower than the national average for an area this size. But I think that's also one of the reasons why we see such high rates of projected growth, because we are catching up there. People are recognizing that Nashville is a tech hub and has lots and lots of opportunity and a workforce that can supply labor to these tech companies who are looking to hire here. When you look at the specific occupation groups, big shocker, the software developers / QA occupations group had the highest demand, with an average of 929 new unique monthly job postings. So the software developer crunch is felt here, much like the rest of the country. And you can see the other groups and kind of where they fall from there. The biggest percent difference from the national average. I do think there are some interesting places where you can see kind of how we compare to the national average. And there are occupation groups where we actually have a much higher number of postings affiliated with these groups. For instance, computer support specialist, we see an almost 23% difference to the positive in the number of jobs that are being marketed here relative to what you would expect to see for a region this size. Same with mathematical science occupations, business and financial operations analysts. So some really interesting insights there. All right, let's zoom in even closer. So thus far, we've been looking at things at this very big picture view. Let's zoom in now and look at demand by job title, because there can be a lot of job titles associated with a given occupation. An occupation can be associated, there's a many-to-many relationship between job titles and occupations. But I think that we live in a world where we process job titles more frequently than we process occupations. So that's why I like zooming down to this level. So when you look at demand by job title, the most in-demand job title was software engineer, which appeared in 1.2% of the postings from July 2019 through June 2020. I think it's important to recognize the diversity of job titles. If the number one job title only represents 1.2% of the postings, that really is reflective of the diversity of work. And also diversity of titles. There's a lack of uniformity in job titles in tech that I think can sometimes be confusing and intimidating for people who are just coming into the field. But as you look at the job titles, the most in demand, you can certainly see that many of them are for development roles, which would help explain why the software development and QA occupations group took top place when looking at the bigger picture. All right, so that's job titles. Now let's take a look at our hard skills. These are going to be the last numbers that we look at before we open it up to Q&A. I'm really excited with getting to interact with y'all on that. So the top 10 hard skills, the number one skill was SQL, structured query language, which appeared in 16% of overall postings. For that same July 2019 to June 2020 time period. And it's not that SQL was the number one across all 26 of the occupations, but it was present a lot. It was the number one skill for 3 of the 26 occupations, but it was somewhere in the top 10 for 9 of those occupations. And so it's that broad prevalence, I think, that really that really explains why it falls at the top of the hard skill list. And then the other thing, you can see software development's presence here as well, the skills that people are looking for and wanting. Agile methodology, software development, Java, JavaScript, software development's presence is definitely felt in all of these top skills, these hard skills as well. So the last thing I want to point out, I have shared a copy of the slide deck as well as a copy of the full report with Dominique. I believe you'll all be receiving a link to today's presentation, but it will also have those materials there so that you don't have to go to middletentech.jobs to download this report. But if you are interested in going back and looking at any of the prior year's reports or taking a look at any of those white papers where we took deep dives into the different subspecialties, that's where you can find those. You're also more than welcome to email me. I've got my contact information on the slide. So you're more than welcome to email, and I'm happy to help in any way that I can. So with that, I will stop the slideshow or stop the share and go open it up to Q&A.
And I will point out that if it's easier, you can also put your questions in the chat, but Q&A is preferred, but we ask that you submit any questions you may have.
Well, I either put you all to sleep or explained it so well that you don't have any questions.
Hey, first of all, I'd like to thank you for doing this every year. This is such a valuable contribution to understanding what's going on in tech. This is Mary Van Valkenberg. I manage the data science and data analytics programs at Nashville Software School. And I know that you said, and I'm sorry, I missed the detail of it early on, that there are new codes coming from BLS for data science.
Yes, you get a dedicated code.
And really curious to understand the demand by minimum experience. I noticed that's straight across zeros for data science in this report, which was a little confusing.
Well, the reason for that is because there weren't enough postings that got mapped to that occupation code for it to be able to generate a number. So I guess let me go back. Here is what I understand about where we are with the state of data science. Prior to the introduction of the 2018 codes, there wasn't a dedicated space for data scientists. My gut had been that data science were getting mapped to the computer and information research scientist role. But then that actually, when the crosswalk was published that explained, okay, here's how the codes from 2010 map to the new 2018 codes, data scientists had previously been lumped into mathematic occupations, all other. So it was really obscure. It's just kind of buried in there with any of the other occupations that they didn't really quite know what to do with. Moving forward, right now, we're in the middle of this three-year interim where the new codes have been developed, and it takes the BLS, they survey over 200,000 companies to get that data, but they don't do every company every year, every quarter. It takes them 3 years to do a full data collection cycle. And so we won't get full-blown numbers. We won't get the full-blown numbers using data scientists as its own dedicated code split out from the other mathematic occupations for a couple of more years. To the thing on the demand, I think that was just that there were so few postings that got mapped to the data science, to the hybrid code that they're using right now. It just wasn't able to generate data. I think they're there. I think they're just I think they're just getting lost in some of the codes. We get great information from this, but it is not perfect in the sense that at the end of the day, the person who's reporting that, a person in a data scientist role who's reporting that to the government, might not have a clear enough understanding of the role or the codes to necessarily get that mapping right in all places. And especially given how new data science is, I think that might have contributed to it. I don't know if that answered your question or not.
It absolutely does. And setting the expectation that it'll take, 3 years for a full cycle is great.
Yeah, I cannot wait till 2022. Because data scientist is not the only one. Like project management, the 2010 codes, it's just, we move fast, job titles change fast, and when you're only developing a new set of codes every 8 years, which I'm sure is a Herculean task, it doesn't keep up with the times. But I'm really excited for the next phase.
Yeah, thank you for that.
You're welcome. Okay, I'm just gonna start. So Cheryl, you said you mentioned some impacts of COVID. What other impacts we might expect? Answer that one live. TBD. I mean, we're already the things, will jobs rebound? Even by the end of 2020, we were starting to see that. And I fully anticipate that we will continue to see that. We are still projecting growth over the next 5 years. It is going to be very interesting to see the impacts that the pandemic has on our ability to move the needle on the diversity numbers. Not just, I'm particularly interested in gender, and most of the media discussion has been around gender. But we also know that diverse, race, ethnicity groups have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So I think it's too early to predict, specifically to the tech space. But those are the things that I think we're all going to be really curious to see. Oh, declines in compensation due to COVID. Not that we've seen thus far, but we don't have data yet. I mean, again, the compensation data in particular comes from government sources. And so that's where it falls into the lag from the QCEW, which is the biggest pool. You know, they do their data collection quarterly. So the last round of 2020 data collection occurred in Q4 of 2020, but there's a 3-quarter lag between when they finish collecting the data and they release it. So it's going to be Q3 of this year before we're able to see. But I am also very curious about that. Lindsay, your question, can you go back to what you're saying about QCEW and the type of people surveyed? You said some self-reported, not the QCEW people. So like I said, the biggest bucket of workers, like just shy of 91% of the jobs we reported, they come from the Bureau of Labor Statistics quarterly census of employment and wages. This is what you typically think of. And I can tell you how many self-reported. It was the smallest group of the smallest category, but that doesn't come from the BLS. The QCEW catches everyone who's in what you would consider to be the traditional employer-employee relationship, either full or part-time. They also capture non-QCEW, which actually non-QCEW is the smallest group. That was just, you know, of the 62,000 jobs that were reported for 2019, it was only 1,300 of them were non-QCEW. Those are people that are in a traditional employer-employee type of relationship, but they're in niches like they're clergy, or they work for churches, or they're railroad workers, stuff like that, just niches that don't fall inside the typical QCEW. The self-employed people, that data comes from the Census Bureau. They conduct a survey called the American Community Survey. And in that American Community Survey, they ask people about their employment, whether or not they're self-employed or not. And so what insight we get into the self-employed tech workforce comes from that American Community Survey. Christine, did you look at the difference in income by gender and by race, ethnicity? By the way, oh, thanks, Christine. And it's good to see you, by the way. I miss seeing you. We don't have it broken down. That I would love it if we could get the data at that level of granularity, but we don't have it. They don't make it available. So here's hoping maybe one day, but at this point in time, we don't have the access to get the answer to that. All right, let's see. I'm trying to, this is my first time with doing the Q&A from this side, so I'm trying to make sure okay, Devanji Patel, do we have jobs by company? Not in the report. You can get to it, but it's noisy. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on it. When we look at the individual occupations as it relates, we don't have it on the actual true job side at all. That's just not something that's available to us because the jobs data is anonymized by all of the government sources so that you're just getting it in the aggregate. On the job demand side, where we're going in and looking at, analyzing job postings, we can get some insight there. I have not looked at that. We don't include it in this report, and I haven't looked at it lately, so I don't have anything specific. But if you're super curious, you're welcome to send me a follow-up email, and I can share with you information that I can pull. Okay, Christina was wondering if you could speak to anticipated growth in tech salaries from the 70K median and any indication what jobs will lead that median salary growth. Well, I mean, management professions are the number one. I don't have projections data on median salary. So, but if you had to look at, I mean, I think the occupations that are going to lead the way in increasing the median salary are the ones that have where the most growth is projected, because the more it grows, the more in demand the workers are going to be. So, you know, it's hard. Management, of course, it's hard to say that software development and QA occupations aren't going to lead that charge. We have a very heavy analyst population here in Middle Tennessee, and those are typically well compensated. So I think that will be part of it too. And as data science gets more of a foothold, I think that will help. That will help too. You were going to have to increase to move the needle on the median. We would have to see a huge growth in the number of jobs. But I guess I would say the drivers of salary are the ones where we expect the most growth, and also the largest occupation groups by volume, because particularly when looking at medians, that's another thing that drives it. All right, Rob Tudor. Can you review page 13 of the report tied to the 4-year or 2-year education levels and opportunities? Reviewing the data, is the market trending more IT jobs posted for lower credentials than a 4-year degree from boot camps or 2-year colleges? All right, Rob, let me get to 13. All right, demand by occupation group. I think we're off by, yeah, demand by education level. I would say in terms of frequency of mentions in job postings, we did not see the needle move that much from to see more. I hesitate to say that we aren't seeing more openness to people with 2-year degrees or different backgrounds, because I feel like we are seeing the needle move on that. We aren't necessarily seeing that by doing a textual analysis of job postings, because the education level that was most frequently mentioned in those job postings was a bachelor's degree. Let me see. Boot camp. That said, I hope I answered your question with that. I think that there's something else that I will say just about, job postings can be tricky to analyze, because just because someone puts in that they want a bachelor's degree, that doesn't mean that they're not more open to hiring from boot camps from 2-year degrees. And I mean, to that point, Mary, the last time I heard data on this from the National Software School was that, I mean, the vast majority of people going through the boot camps have a bachelor's degree. So they check the box for a bachelor's. It's just whether or not that bachelor's is actually in a tech focused career, you know, whether it's a tech background or what. So I think anecdotally we're seeing it change. Maybe not so much in terms of the frequency of 2-year degrees or boot camps, those words being mentioned explicitly in the text of a job posting, which is what it is that we're using to analyze this. You know, on the demand by minimum experience level, that chart, this has been, I mean, to begin with, of the postings that we looked at, the vast majority of them didn't explicitly mention a minimum experience level at all. But of those that did, the biggest bucket is 2 to 3 years, and I think that is. I know that we've seen in software development that sometimes employers are kind of rigid and not willing to bring in the junior level employees because they just feel like they need someone who can hit the ground running. But that said, keep in mind, I mean, job postings are like a wish list. You write the job posting as though, you know, that would be your perfect ideal candidate. Just because they say there's a bachelor's and they say that you need 2 to 3 years minimum experience doesn't mean that they won't take someone that has an amazing background that might not necessarily check those boxes. I would love to fundamentally alter the way that job postings are written so that they wouldn't discourage really good candidates from applying by making the criteria seem a bit unattainable. But that's what we see in the data. It is still bachelor's is most frequently mentioned, and that 2 to 3 years of experience. Rob says, agree on challenges, analyzing job postings, written one way, yet may verbalize it differently or be flexible in approach. Absolutely. Yeah, that's that could be a whole different set of research right there. If I had all the time in the world, I would go down that rabbit hole for sure. Lindsay, thank you. Mitch Ribello, how well correlated do you feel projections for Middle Tennessee are for the nation at large? That's actually in the study. And I'm not going to share my slides again, but I will go back. I want to say our projections were 16%, and projections for tech job growth across the nation were 9%, but let me double check that number. I wish to goodness I had a photographic memory and could keep all of it in my mind. And where do you think they will diverge the most? I think the places that we're already seeing the divergence. I mean, if you look like demand by occupation group, you know, the ones computer support specialists, I feel like a lot of that is because of the presence of companies like Assurion that are really large companies that also have a huge support component to their business model. You know, software developers, QA occupations, you know, well, actually, these aren't growth projections. This is demand. So I'm going to back up. I don't want to mix apples with oranges, because this is job postings data. The question that you're asking is really about what is really about the actual jobs and where you're going to say with those. And what I would suggest, since you're going to the part, if you want to get deep in the weeds on this, the entire back half of the report lists the projection, gives information about projections, where the number of jobs here deviates from, you know, what the number of jobs here is, how different from that is, plus or minus, you know, from the national average. So I really think that taking a look at those individual occupations, taking a look at that part of the report may help you get the answers to the questions you're asking. Thank you, Cheryl. Let's see. And I feel like, Dominique, have I gone over time? This was supposed to end at, I'm happy to stick around, but I think technically this was supposed to end at 11:45.
No, you're totally fine. If you can stay, I'm happy to stay on. Yeah.
Mitch, I'm with you. I love the weeds. That's where I would rather stay. All right, Lindsay, one thing that makes it hard for applicants is knowing that a lot of companies use applicant tracking systems that objectively filter out applicants who don't meet all the quote requirements, thus discouraging potentially good applicants from applying. Employers never see those resumes in this case. Yeah, I agree. Those systems, I mean, I get that big companies are fielding so many applications. I understand why those systems exist, but I think that I think it's unfortunate, and I think that that's a place where we really need to rethink system design and what it is that we're trying. And I will say, especially as we start, if we say we want to increase the diversity of the workforce, then using those sorts of cookie cutter tracking systems that actually that may have bias unintentionally built into them, it's deeply concerning. Susan, how does a graduate with specific hard skills match job postings since lack of all the uniformities in job titles? Susan, it is such research. I mean, I'm actually working on an academic research project with a colleague at MTSU right now, exploring this issue as it relates to business analyst and systems analyst and what the differences between those are, and how, people trying to apply for jobs can figure out, can suss out what it is that which jobs they should look for. And unfortunately, it's a matter of, you just really have to go in and you have to read every single job description. And I'm just using business analyst as an example, but if there are 5 job postings for a business analyst, you probably don't want to apply for all 5, because you could read the 5 and they could each have a very different list of technical, of the skill sets that are being asked of the job. So it's labor intensive on the part of the job seeker. And it's unfortunate, but it is the way it is. I mean, it's easier now that we do have the online tracking systems that allow employers as well as job seekers to do very specific keyword searches to find the things that they might be best qualified for. But it's a heck of a lot of legwork. Did that answer your question? Okay.
And we have 2 questions over in the chat.
Okay. Okay. For some reason, all right, I've got the Q&A.
And I can read it out to you if that's easier.
Yeah, it's not, okay, here we go. What organizations offer mentorships and or coaching for women in tech? You asked a great question. Women in Technology Tennessee, which is an amazing organization. I'm vice president, so I will toot its horn. But we do have mentoring. We have collegiate mentoring programs. We are this year in the process of putting together a mentoring program for WIT members, so that WIT members can be coached by sort of more junior WIT members can be coached by more senior level WIT members, or other senior IT women in the community who are willing to volunteer for the program. So I would say subscribe to the WIT newsletter. I'm sure that will be at the top of the list communicated as soon as we get that program launched. Another group, I don't know if they do formal mentoring, but Women Get It, with it capitalized for Women Get IT. They're another organization in town that I know they do like speed coaching, or they do periodic events. I think they kind of stepped back from it in 2020 due to the pandemic, but I know that they're relaunching in 2021 for International Women's Day. And as their programming kind of spins back up, that would be another group that I would encourage. But I think that there's, WIT exists to offer mentorships, formal and informal, to people aspiring to or working in tech. So I will be more than happy. Actually, I will put it in the chat. That is our website where you can check out more about the organization. And also, if you do want to subscribe, you can check that out. All right, Trevor, indications are in IT that most organizations have hunkered down, put on hold any project work, and look to maintain their existing infrastructure. Does the data tell you what companies are starting to see growth in roles relating to new project work? I do not have that level of visibility. It's too early to see that in the jobs data. And That's really interesting, but at present, there isn't a way to tease out the project-based work from more like from full or part-time work in an actual employer-employee relationship. Now, that's not much information. I'm sorry. I wish I had more on that. That's an interesting point. All right. Well, that looks like it takes care of the questions. For those of y'all who are still on, thank you so much for coming. Dominique, is there anything you need to do to wrap up?
No, thank you so much for giving this report, and thank you for everyone coming and asking questions. You did great, Amy, on the report and answering all the questions. So I think that really wraps it up. I will send a copy of this recording out along with those materials that are referenced as well.
Great. Thank y'all. Have a great rest of the day and a good weekend. Yay, Friday.